Cool. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Tackling Toxicity in the New Mexico Permian. My name is Kevin Richardson. I'm with Halt to Harm Network. I will be your MC for today, also be your tech support. So please feel free to drop any messages to me in the chat if you have any technical abilities. I'm very excited for today's webinar. We are co-hosting today's event with Wild Earth Guardians, Citizens Caring for the Future, and Frac Alliance. And as I mentioned, I'm with Halt to Harm Network. So we're always grateful to host these webinars to highlight oil and gas activities throughout regions of the United States, as well as the grassroots activism, all the local residents and community leaders who are doing their best to fight and protect their communities from oil and gas harms. For today's event, we have quite a lineup of representatives from New Mexico. Halt to Harm, we've done quite a bit of work in different states like Colorado, Pennsylvania, New York, but we have not done as much to highlight what's happening in New Mexico. And I think for today's context, the fact that the New Mexico Permian Basin is the fastest growing site of oil extraction in the country makes today's presentation, I think, exceptionally important for folks across the country, as well as the examples of grassroots community leaders and organizations fighting back against toxic harms that are impacting their local communities' health and environment. So I'm really excited to showcase those for you today. I'm going to go over our agenda real quick, then I'm going to get out of the way and let our presenters do their thing. So for today, we're starting out with introductions. Again, I'm with Halt to Harm Network. I'll drop some information on our organization and how to join us in just a second. After our introductions, we're going to hear from Kaylee Shoup, who's from Citizens Caring for the Future. They're an organization based in New Mexico, and she's based in Carlsbad, New Mexico. And she'll be talking about background on what's happening in New Mexico Permian, some of the health impacts, some of her work to help push back against what's happening there, as well as giving us some broad strokes about what's going on with the state political context in New Mexico. After that, we're going to hear from Sarah Granado, who's a resident of Jal, New Mexico, who's right in the middle of it. She'll be providing a firsthand account of what life is like living in the New Mexico Permian. After that, we'll hear from Melissa Troutman from Wild Earth Guardians. She'll talk about New Mexico's role in oil production, the climate impacts, as well as some of the other environmental air and water impacts as well. And to close this out, we'll hear from Charlie Barrett from Earthworks, who's a thermographer. He'll talk about methane and air pollution impacts in the region, as well as some of their efforts to get better regulation on methane releases and air pollution releases in the New Mexico Permian. Once we're done with these presentations, we'll move into a general Q&A. As always, I invite folks to first introduce themselves in the chat, and then also drop your questions in the chat as we go along. We'll take care of all of them at the very, very end, but sometimes folks will stop and answer a question too. But I encourage you to just keep dropping questions and comments in the chat, especially encouraging comments as you hear about some of the difficult things that folks are dealing with throughout these states. So with that, that's the general kind of run of show. Again, drop your questions in the chat and please introduce yourself in the chat. I will give you a quick word about Halt to Harm Network. If some of you are familiar with us, others are not, but we're a network of grassroots organizations, individuals who are fighting not just fracking, but oil and gas farms throughout the United States, especially in the oil and gas regions. We exist as a private network where you can connect with other folks, advocates, organizers, and experts who are working to protect their communities from these same harms. I encourage you all to join our network. We have a discussion forum in addition to hosting webinar events like this. We also provide campaign support for actions and events that folks are putting on to advance their campaigns, and a number of other services and features too. So it's all free, so feel free to join. I'll drop the link to that in the chat. I'm also going to drop links to Wild Earth Guardians, Citizens Caring for the Future, and Frac Alliance, so you connect with those organizations as well. Yeah. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to do a quick introduction of our first speaker, and then we'll move from there. And so first up, we're going to have Kaylee Shoup from Carlsbad, New Mexico. Kaylee is a community organizer with Citizens Caring for the Future. She was born and raised in Southeast New Mexico. After leaving home in 2010 and returning back home in 2018, she realized that her community had greatly changed due to the Permian fracking boom. It was at that time that her passion for environmental activism was awakened. And I will say that Kaylee is doing the very, very hard work out there in the Permian Basin, especially in the New Mexico region, of fighting back against these issues. And I don't think there is a ton of support for that there. And so I'm really grateful for all the activism she does and also for taking time to share with us today. So with that, I'll pass it to Kaylee.
Thank you for those kind words, Kevin. I really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for being here today. I'm going to share my screen with you. Little presentation here. All righty. So can everyone see that? Okay. So as Kevin said, my name is Kaylee Shoup, and I'm a community organizer based in Carlsbad, New Mexico, with a very small grassroots environmental advocacy group called Citizens Caring for the Future. And our mission is to bring together southeastern New Mexico community members who support protecting our air, land, and water during this current oil boom. And so we do a lot of work here in the region to advocate for clean air and water, and to make sure that frontline communities like ours aren't left behind as the world transitions to cleaner energy sources. So it's very likely that the last barrel of oil will be pumped here in the Permian Basin. And it's a big concern that we are going to, have our land completely decimated by this industry. Obviously, fracking is a very water reliant process. And so we want to make sure that we still have land to live on, water to drink, that our air is clean enough to breathe. And so that's really what we're advocating for here in southeastern New Mexico and in the Permian Basin, which, as Kevin mentioned, is the most active oil field in the country, or oil basin in the country. And you don't hear a lot about the Permian Basin, and that is on account of the fact that, the politics in the region, it's a very conservative area, southeastern New Mexico. While it's in New Mexico, this great progressive state, we're in our own little red corner. And so there's not many folks doing this work in this particular area. And so that's something we're always trying to shine a light on the Permian Basin and bring it up to folks, because people that are working even in the climate space or are very engaged don't always know what's going on here. And I'm very open to being corrected on this, but to my knowledge, Citizens Caring for the Future, we are more or less the only group of our kind that's doing this work in the region. And by that I mean comprised of folks that are, living and working in southeastern New Mexico. So a little bit about how Citizens Caring for the Future got started. So, and Charlie will have updated images here. That's some thermography from Earthworks. So Citizens Caring for the Future got started back in the spring of 2019. There is a national group called Interfaith Power and Light that has a New Mexico chapter. And along with Earthworks, they would lead these immersion retreats into the Permian Basin, where they would bring folks from around the country, around the state. We've had folks from around the world that come to the Permian to, really see what's going on here, as it's one of the, methane hotspots in the world. And it's a very vast area. It's just, a lot of it is desert, and there's thousands upon thousands of oil and gas sites. And it's really something that you can't quite comprehend until you see it. And Earthworks goes out during these retreats often with us to show folks the pollution in action, so that people can really see methane pollution as it's happening. And so back in 2019, they led one of these retreats. And they always try to bring, a local perspective and get local folks involved. And Interfaith Power and Light does this from, a faith angle, which here in southeastern New Mexico is a pretty efficient way to do it, because the churches are very active. So to organize, it's a great route to organize. And so they had gotten some faith leaders together to talk to this group that was coming through for the retreat, and just to discuss their concerns. And in 2019, a lot of the concerns were, people were talking about these things often, because this was, the beginning of this Permian oil and gas boom. And we were seeing large changes in our community. And in West Texas and Southeast New Mexico, we've always had a history of oil and gas production, but it really took on a whole new form when this Permian fracking boom came into play. So in Carlsbad, for instance, we saw an influx of about 20,000 people. All of a sudden, we had this crazy truck traffic going through town. Our highways, we were having daily fatal car crashes. A lot of these would go unreported because it would be people from, different states. It's a big transient community from the oil and gas industry. And so we were seeing all of these systemic issues, things like man camps popping up. And then on top of that, people dealing with all of a sudden having an oil and gas site in their backyard. We had a lot of agriculture in the area. A lot of those, farms or ranches have now been sold to oil and gas. So we were seeing really a lot of changes at a very, very rapid pace. And so these faith leaders came and were sharing all of these things with the group, and they heard one another talking and realized that, oh my gosh, we have the same concerns. We should get together to do something about this. And that's a really big deal because here in the area, people don't always talk about their concerns when it comes to oil and gas. And that's because a lot of people are working for the industry or they're economically dependent on the industry. And then also you can really face social backlash in these communities when you say, well, I think I might be having this health issue because of oil and gas. And so people are very, very hesitant to speak out. And that's something that we continue to see to this day. But when these faith leaders heard one another talking, they realized that, oh, I'm not alone in this. And so that was really, really meaningful. And that's how Citizens Caring for the Future was born. And some of the early work of the group included, learning how to give comments at New Mexico methane hearings or just public hearings of any kind, talking with the media, shining a light, saying that, there's people here living in this area that are concerned about this. Not everyone is, full steam ahead on oil and gas. And then also learning to talk to their neighbors about these concerns. As I mentioned, that's sometimes a difficult thing. We have to be careful in how we talk about these issues. Early on, one of the large concerns was a lack of air monitoring in our communities. And, we've made inroads with that. And we've played an integral role in advocating for environmental safeguards on a state and national level. And we're a leading voice, for a transition to a greener economy in the state of New Mexico. We work on a myriad of issues. There's air quality issues, there's water issues. Melissa's going to talk about some of these myriad of problems. And in New Mexico, oil and gas production takes place, it's checkerboard. So a lot of it is on state land or on federal land. And so we're always working on really a lot of different fronts in terms of advocacy. For example, here in Carlsbad, we have the Carlsbad Caverns. You've probably heard of the Carlsbad Caverns National Park. And, that is a unique geology in the region. And so we're working to make sure that Carlsbad Caverns is protected, and then also Lechuguilla Cave, which is one of the biggest caving systems in the world. Very small percentage of it has been explored. And the research that goes on in that cave, is responsible for breakthroughs in cancer research and all of these really important things. And so we have these ecosystems that are very, very precious in this particular region. And so we're working to make sure that those ecosystems are protected from oil and gas production as it continues to really encroach. And there's also an increase in seismicity that, puts these caves at risk from having fracking in the area. Not to mention in Carlsbad, we have karst aquifers, which, are very prone to pollution and at higher risk of pollution than your average aquifer because of the limestone geology. And so that's just kind of an example of how many different, areas we're working in when it comes to advocating here. On a local level, we really just try to make sure that we are educating people on the health risks that come with living near oil and gas. A large percentage of our population now lives within a half mile of an oil and gas site. A lot of these oil and gas sites are centered in areas that, are not as well off, and neighborhoods that are people of color. And so people are really being disproportionately impacted by this oil and gas production. As I mentioned, historically, we have always had oil and gas. So people have grown up with it and, really don't think much about how it might be impacting their health. And then not to mention, again, we're in a conservative area. Leadership in the area is very conservative. And so no one's really talking about, the downsides of having these things right next to your home or right next to your schools. And so we really try to connect those dots for people and teach them about, asthma attacks, there can be an increase in that. Difficulty breathing, you can have endocrine issues by living near oil and gas, all these different health issues that come with that, and just tying that together for them. And when we talk to folks, it's really quite interesting, and tell them about, oh, well, this health issue could be connected, and they'll go, oh my gosh, that's what I have. And from there, we try to teach them about, ways that they can protect themselves on a personal level, but also on a community level. And that's where you get more into the advocacy. So this slide here is just an example of something that we might hand out to people in order to educate them on, those health harms that they might be suffering from and how they can protect themselves. And then also who they can talk to if they have a site by their house that is causing them issues, because that's something that there's really not really any education on, but there's people living right next door to really problematic sites. Also, we have a program where we distribute air purifiers to folks that are living near oil and gas sites to try to get the air in their home a little bit cleaner. So that's something really exciting that we've got to do. And then on that other picture on there, that's just an example of an immersion retreat that I mentioned earlier. We go out to sites, and that's really a retreat where you're out in the middle of the field. So I'm going to stop screen sharing here for a second. And then I just also wanted to speak a little bit about how New Mexico is this very, unique place when it comes to the politics of the region. And let me pull up my notes here. Sorry about that. So New Mexico is, as you all probably know, a very progressive state. As I mentioned, Southeast New Mexico is its own little corner that is kind of the red corner of the state. So in theory, you would think, oh, we can make a lot of great inroads when it comes to environmental safeguards in the state of New Mexico, since we have a Democratic-led legislature. That is not always the case, though. New Mexico is, the whole state really, a sacrifice zone in many ways. So we have Los Alamos National Laboratories here. That comes with a, high environmental impact. Navajo Nation also has a lot of oil and gas development in that region. There's a legacy of uranium mining. Here in Southeast New Mexico, we also have WIPP, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, and that is where we store low-level nuclear waste underground here in Southeast New Mexico. So the whole state, in many ways, is a sacrifice zone. But to kind of center back in onto oil and gas, New Mexico typically receives, and this is since the Permian oil boom, over $4 billion from direct revenue from oil and gas production. And this past fiscal year, that accounted for about 50% of the state budget. So you have this really interesting political dynamic where we're getting all of this income from oil and gas from an area that is sending very conservative leadership. And, it doesn't really behoove the leaders to take any really meaningful action to curb oil and gas development. We've had a really hard time getting something as simple as, a statewide setback passed on account of this political dynamic. And so that's something that we're always having to, deal with. Just for a little bit more context for you all. The state's general fund, and this data is a little bit old, so it could be a little off. Since fiscal year 2011, the state of New Mexico's general fund has increased by 1.4 billion. So that's about a 20% increase. In comparison, the New Mexico Environment Department's general fund, and that's the main environmental agency that is tasked with overseeing the oil and gas industry, they've only seen a 4.7% increase since fiscal year 2011. So obviously that's very disproportionate. Our environmental regulatory agencies are very understaffed, underfunded. It would take about 6.5 years for air quality enforcement staff to inspect all of the permittees in the state. So I really refer to this area as the wild, wild west. We have a lot of regulation, but no one's really paying attention to whether or not that regulation is being enforced, and these emission events go unaccounted for every single day. We have about 110,000, and that's probably a smaller number than the actual number of oil and gas sites in the state. And so it's a very large number. And here in Southeast New Mexico, we only have 3 air monitoring stations to monitor ozone pollution. And in West Texas, they don't have any air monitoring stations. So that kind of goes to tell you that we're getting a very incomplete snapshot of what is happening. And because of high ozone levels reported in New Mexico, the EPA was actually looking at deeming the Permian Basin a non-attainment zone. They've since stepped away from that, but that's just a little bit of an idea of what we're dealing with in this particular region and an overview. From there, I will pass it on back to Kevin to our next speaker.
Well, huge thanks, Kaylee, for sharing all that information and for all your work. That was very enlightening, and yeah, I've learned a lot about the New Mexico context. As Kaylee sort of highlighted what's happening in southeastern New Mexico, our next speaker is going to be from the farthest, most southeastern corner of that part of New Mexico, a small town called Jal, New Mexico, Jal. If you type it into Google Maps, you'll see that it's a stone's throw from Odessa and the other sort of parts of the West Texas Permian Basin, Kermit, Texas, and other places like that. Our next speaker is Sarah Granado. She is living in the middle of all of this, dealing with pollution from everything from frac sand mining to oil and gas, conventional drilling, fracking, as well as dealing with the truck traffic issues that Kaylee spoke about, the work at the man camps, and things like that. Such a wide range of issues that are converging on her small community and making life difficult there. Sarah is very much a sort of lone wolf, a person who kind of going alone, willing to speak out about these issues. She's looking to hopefully get better regulation of oil and gas in her area to alleviate some of the major impacts that she'll be talking about when she speaks. I really appreciate Sarah for her courage, for being willing to speak to us today, and for being willing to talk about what's happening there. I'll pass it to her to kind of tell us her story and give us a context for kind of what the worst of the worst is in the New Mexico Permian Basin. Thank you, Sarah.
Oh, well, thank you. That summed it up pretty much. Oh my goodness, I've not prepared any slides. Or
Okay.
this is just a short message that may be relevant in this conversation. As I do live in a town where no matter your financial status, you live near a well in one way or another. The environmental problems that surround me now are detrimental, but they weren't always. As a citizen of New Mexico, I can attest to that. I was born in El Paso, Texas in 1991 to a father who worked for El Paso Natural Gas, and within 2 weeks of my birth, we moved here, back to his hometown of Jal, New Mexico, where he continued to work for El Paso for 30 more years. Now, as a concerned citizen, I thought I knew about the dangers of oil and gas and fracking, but only from what my father has told me. But after doing some more extensive research, I realized like roughly 70% of this town, I didn't know much at all. Please feel free to correct these numbers if they are wrong, but I didn't know that as of January 2024, mineralanswers.com and shellx.com state that my county, Lee County, New Mexico, ranks #1 in oil production nationally and #2 in gas production statewide. It also states that Lee County accounts for 56.92% of oil production in New Mexico and 37.01% of gas production in New Mexico. Nearly 45,000 oil and gas wells in my county alone, 18,000 of those drilled this year, but only 13.5 of those have permits on file. I also didn't know that hydraulic fracturing is extremely dangerous because it uses chemicals in the process that are hazardous to our health, like benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, formaldehyde, methanol, lead, hydrochloric acid. And that's just to name a few out of hundreds more, as well as the trade secret chemicals oil and gas companies refuse to be transparent about. These chemicals are often used in fracking fluid to aid the extraction process, but can pose risk to human health and the environment if not properly managed. I was never made aware of this. I was never made aware of these facts. But after reading that, there's no question as to why, as time goes on, health problems grow bigger, quality of life declines, and the passionate awareness of such things is as bad as sinning on a Sunday. Hi, I'm Sarah Granado. I'm a single mother of 2 daughters from Lee County and the boomtown of Jal, New Mexico. And I'm here to bring forth my perspective and hopefully do what I can to try and ensure a cleaner future for my children as well as everyone else's. Honestly, the residual effects of living near the OG industry never bothered me until recently, after I had children and fracking came to be. And to know the truth has me, for lack of better words, fuming. I was curious as to where our tap water was coming from because it feels harder to me as of lately. And I never did find that out, but it started to click a few days before picture day at my child's school, and I found myself on Google looking through different images of class pictures, and I couldn't help but notice how much healthier kids from other schools looked versus kids from ours. And that reminded me of the time my 6-year-old daughter asked me what that awful smell was on our way to Kermit one evening. It was the first time I had ever had to explain the oil and gas industry to anyone. She kept asking questions about the mines and the large piles of sand that we'd see along the highway. And I didn't have the answer. I didn't have the answer to her questions. The questions that she asked, I kind of wanted to know the answer to myself. Then she said, "Can we play in the frac sand?" And I told her, "No, baby, it's poison." She said, "Why do they use it if it's poison?" And I said, "It's not poison at first. They make it that way to make more money at a faster pace." And she said, that's when she said, "They poison the sand to make money? It sounds like an evil villain wants to defeat us." And then she started to laugh. Then it hit me. Fracking has escalated extraction so much that it's noticeably affecting our well-being. This is just a guess, and most likely our water, because if not, why can't I find its source? But anyway, as you know, oil and gas pays well. And because of that, I've never needed a thing growing up, due to the stability oil and gas has given my father and our family. And although I am thankful for that, now as a single mother years later, I can't help but to see what raising raising kids in this place is doing to their health. Okay, so now that you all kind of have an idea of who I am and what led me here, let me help you feel how I feel. Do me a favor. Do me a favor and pretend that you are in the woods with a shotgun, a loaded shotgun. As you hike along the trails about 10 yards ahead of you, you see a wolf. Are you worried? No. Why would you be? It's one wolf. You've got a double-barrel shotgun. Right now, this wolf is outnumbered by bullets, but it's big and it's beautiful and it's vicious. So you put two and two together and realize that if you're quiet, you can just turn and walk away without having to worry about shooting it or inciting a chase. So you decide to turn and quietly keep hiking up the trail, where, to your surprise, you are met with another wolf. So you turn slightly and go in a different direction, and yet again you're met with a wolf. So you turn all the way around and go the opposite direction, and again another wolf blocks your path. Suddenly the tables have turned. The odds have changed, and they are no longer in your favor. You still have your gun, but now you're completely surrounded by wolves. Is it safe to say that you and your shotgun no longer stand a chance? Well, can you pretend that that lone wolf at the beginning of the story was the oil and gas industry, and each wolf that began to surround you in the pack represents a different environmental danger that we've slowly but surely come to face today? My gun against one wolf, I'm the boss. My gun against a pack of wolves, I'm dinner. Do you see my conundrum? Before hydraulic fracturing, the smog in the sky and the aroma of H2S were just mild irritants, never occurring more than once or twice a week. But just like the natural order of the wolf pack, these irritants began to bond and form more irritants, which led to a whole litter of environmental wolves by which I am now surrounded. And my voice is my only weapon. In my humble opinion, I believe it's imperative that we address the health disparities and environmental injustices faced by communities like mine in southern New Mexico. Though my entire community probably wouldn't agree with my labeling this environmental injustice, I, for one, cannot ignore the detrimental effects of living near oil and gas operations any longer. I believe by prioritizing the health and well-being of our residents first, and then by trying to implement stricter regulations on the industry, that's when we can start to begin to mitigate the harmful impacts and create a safer, healthier environment for everyone. I realize bills have been sitting on desks of actual lawmakers for far too long, and I realize that what I've just said is indeed easier said than done, but it's possible. I'm no educated expert, but I myself have some ideas about how to more efficiently regulate some specific wolves out there. As far as air quality is concerned, maybe assigning a task force whose only goal is to locate and report specific unregulated flare emissions out in the more remote areas of the oil field and to report them to the people who can actually enforce state law. It's giving gas meter maid meets like hall monitor kind of vibes. And it only makes sense if the task forces also lived in said remote areas. I also have a few interesting and out-of-the-box ideas about how to reduce emissions from gas flares near my area and hopefully abroad. It involves the idea of centralizing flares and then capturing and storing emissions, along with CCS becoming a mandatory step in regulational laws in operation. And I know this is a reach, but Denton, Texas has completely banned hydraulic fracturing as an extraction modality altogether. I aspire to be like them one day. Honestly, as someone who's down here in the depths of it every single day, I shouldn't also be worried about who gets fresh water, us or big oil. And I'm definitely not worried about being more economically sound or bringing new business to our county, because in my humble opinion, if we don't get more infrastructures like hospitals, clinics, rehab centers, children's homes, and homeless shelters, and if we don't start holding the oil and gas and fracking companies accountable for what's happening to the air, land, and water, then we probably won't have the option to bring more lucrative businesses to our state. Because if southern Mexico continues to turn a blind eye to the toxicity that it's in, then we won't have the society needed for economic gain. As for the future, I remain optimistic that with continued advocacy and collective action, we can overcome these challenges and build a more sustainable and less endangered society. Let's work together to protect our health and our environment and the well-being of future generations. In conclusion, while the challenges that we face may seem daunting, I'm hopeful that raising awareness can get us on the path to a safer tomorrow. Together, let's continue to stand up against the wolves of environmental degradation and work towards a sustainable and thriving world for our children, for us all. And I appreciate Frac Tracker for helping me to meet these fine folks that put this webinar together. And I'm grateful for the time and for all of you for hearing what I had to say today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was great. There's lots of love in the chat. One thing I wanted to ask you real quick is, and when we talked about this before, you gave me the great visual of what the air looked like outside. I wonder if you could just talk about that for 10 seconds real fast about what kind of looks like on a day-to-day basis from all the mining.
Well, the dust storm, the wind really brings it in. Like, it's more when the wind brings it around, it's just, it's a consistent tan. The sky really isn't blue that much these days, especially when it's windy.
No, for sure. Well, I appreciate you sharing all that. Thank you for your testimony. That was very powerful. And like I said, Sarah's has a very unique and rare perspective, someone living in the middle of all this who's willing to speak out about it. So I applaud you for your courage and appreciate that. And a community of folks here who are here to support you and help you out in any way you can. So appreciate that for coming on today and joining this webinar. We'll hear more from Sarah, I think, as things evolve out there. And yeah, look forward if anyone has any connections to that place or connection to that part of New Mexico, activism, things like that, any support for what's going on there, feel free to reach out and connect with Sarah. And we'll provide ways to do that as well. With that, I'm going to move on to go to our next speaker. We have with us Melissa Troutman, who's based in Santa Fe, but works for Wild Earth Guardians that does work throughout the entire state. She's their climate and energy advocate with Wild Earth Guardians. And after a decade of being an award-winning investigative journalist, she transitioned to policy reach and advocacy. At the Guardians, her work is focused on just, equitable protections for wildlife, people, workers, and the climate from fossil fuel pollution and harm in New Mexico. And I think, like Kaylee mentioned, there's not a ton of folks in southeastern New Mexico who are dealing with these issues, and Wild Earth Guardians is another group in New Mexico that's fighting hard to turn the tide on oil, gas extraction and pollution in the state, as well as the state's outsized impact on climate change. And Melissa, you're gonna give us some more context for what's happening in the state and some of the solutions that folks are proposing and fighting hard to implement.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And thank you to Kaylee, and big thanks to Sarah. I know it takes a lot of courage to speak out when you're living in an oil field community, and you did so well. You made us feel what it's like to be there, and I know we've never met, but I can tell your spirit is so strong, and I hope we get to meet in person soon. Like Kevin said, I am going to zoom out a little bit to the context of oil and gas development, particularly in the Mexico Permian, and then focus on some of the stuff that we can do about the problems that folks like Sarah are facing. Just want to check in really quickly that you can hear me okay and see my slides.
Yep, looks great. You sound great.
All right, awesome. Okay, so I don't want to take up too much time. I feel like we're getting a little crunched. So I'm from Wild Earth Guardians. You can look us up on our website. And let's keep moving along. So we're talking about tackling toxicity today in the New Mexico Permian, obviously. We've already heard from from Kaylee and Sarah about a little bit about what such a unique and special place that the Permian is. I'm going to dial in a little bit more to some of the pollution crises specific to the Permian. And then, like I said, we're going to get into some of the stuff we can do together. But first, a poll. So I'm going to read this question. We're going to come back to it in a little bit. How much toxic wastewater is produced per barrel of oil in the New Mexico Permian? Is it 1 barrel of oil to 1 barrel of toxic wastewater? Or is it 1 to 4, 1 to 10, 1 to 100? Take a quick guess. And we're going to come back to that. Like we've already mentioned, the Permian is a really unique place. First of all, very unique flora and fauna to this part of the world, including the lesser prairie chicken, which used to call a lot more of these animals used to call the Permian home, but it is now endangered in this region and facing extinction due to habitat loss, fragmentation, and climate change. We're also in a place of incredibly unique and delicate cave and karst ecosystem, including Carlsbad Caverns National Park, which Kaylee has already talked about. And the Permian oil field happens to be in this really unique place, making it even more unique. The Permian is the highest producing oil field on planet Earth right now. In the country, the United States, the so-called United States of America, that is the #1 oil producer on planet Earth right now. And we're in New Mexico, which is where oil production is growing faster than any other place in the United States. So when we dial in to New Mexico Permian, this is a really fast growing and problematic area when it comes to a lot of things, both immediate pollution for the area and the greater global climate. Some of these unique threats to the Permian. On the left, well, you're seeing a map of the United States. This is by U.S. Drought Monitor. This is data from last week. It's hopefully not too hard to see, but down in the southeast corner of New Mexico, there's a really dark blob. And that really dark blob means exceptional drought. It is the worst level of drought that they have in their indicators. That also happens to be overlain with the Permian Basin region. So worst drought in the country in southeast New Mexico. On the right, another threat to water in New Mexico. This report came out also last week from The Guardian that New Mexico's rivers are the most threatened waterways in the United States. More than 90% of the state's surface waters lack federal protections because they are ephemeral, meaning they don't run all year. And so therefore, they do not fit into the classification of a surface water that has strong federal protections. So there's a drought, water scarcity is a problem, and water protection is a real problem in New Mexico. And that's a big problem because oil and gas production, extraction, inherently comes with water contamination and pollution impacts that we'll talk more about in a minute. Touch very lightly on air. On the left, you're looking at a graph of this is a graph that shows Permian air emissions or leak rates compared to what the EPA estimates is actually being leaked, compared to the industry's target for how much it's going to allow itself to leak. So as you can see on the bottom, the industry target is surpassed by the EPA estimate. And that EPA estimate is far surpassed by the actual amount of emissions. So when I say emissions, what I'm really talking about here is methane emissions. And methane is not only at least 80 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period, but methane is also the primary contributor to ground level ozone. So the EPA is underestimating the amount that is being emitted in the Permian by 3 times. The image on the right is an aerial view of the Permian Basin oil patch. This is what it looks like. This is an area that, as Kaylee mentioned, has exceeded national air quality standards for ozone the past several years as oil and gas production has increased. And even though this has been the case for several years, more and more air permits for new emissions, new facilities and emission sources are always being permitted by the state of New Mexico. And Charlie's going to talk a bit more about air in a minute, but I'm going to hone in on oil and gas waste. Here's another big problem about the oil field is that oil and gas waste is produced far more than actual oil and gas. So there's a little hint for that poll. It's not actually 1-to-1. It's not 1 barrel of toxic wastewater to 1 barrel of oil. And this stuff is hazardous. It contains hazardous materials, heavy metals, benzene, secret chemicals, PFAS, and other toxins that have a range of health effects from dizziness to cancer. But oil and gas waste has been exempt from hazardous waste, federal hazardous waste law since 1988, thanks to industry lobbying. And when industry lobbied, they said, well, this is complying with hazardous waste law is a real economic burden for us. But year after year, we've seen the industry make record profits. Oil and gas CEOs are some of the richest people on the planet, and they could have complied with hazardous waste law all of this time and still made billions of dollars. And this is problem not just inside the oil fields, but outside the oil fields as well. The image you see on the left of this slide shows New Mexico landfills accepting chemical-laced oil and gas waste. And we have the Permian oil field down in the southeast corner. We have the San Juan oil field up in the northwest corner. But most of these landfills are in places in between. Some of them really close to urban centers like Albuquerque and Santa Fe. There's one in Taos. There's one in Clovis. There's one right outside of Silver City. There's one outside of Las Cruces. So this waste is being transported all across the state. What is oil and gas waste? For the sake of time, I'm just going to touch on there's liquid waste such as the wastewater, also the leachate that leaches out of the landfills where oil and gas waste is disposed. There's solid wastes, the earth and rock cuttings that come up from drilling, the fracking sand that was mentioned, equipment. And then there's stuff in between, drilling muds and sludges from things like treatment processes and pipe scale, which can be very, very highly radioactive. In New Mexico, there are on average 4 liquid oil and gas waste spills every single day. The #1 material spilled is so-called produced water. This is toxic wastewater. And the #1 cause for these spills is equipment failure, followed by corrosion, which are, of course, preventable causes. There's almost zero enforcement of these spills in terms of violations and fines. New permits are given to repeat offenders all the time. And like Sarah said, mentioned with regard to chemical, undisclosed chemicals, we don't know the chemical contents of these spills the majority of the time, because the industry, according to New Mexico law, is allowed to hide they're allowed to hide the identities of some of their chemicals as confidential trade secrets, as proprietary to their unique operations. A big shout out to Frac Tracker, who just made us this brand new map of oil and gas spills. These are liquid spills, and as you can see, they are clustered down in the Permian Basin in the lower corner, and then up in the San Juan Basin in the upper left corner. Zooming in a bit to the greater Carlsbad region, you'll see a lot of yellow and green dots. Both of these colors indicate spills. The yellow dots are spills where the volume or the amount spilled has not been reported, and the green dots are where spill volumes and amounts have been reported to the state. When a company spills, it's upon them to report it to the state, And when you click on one of these dots, we're going to share by the way, we will share, hopefully Kevin already did, share a link to this map in the chat so you can explore it on your own. But when you click on a dot, a text box will come up that will give you the name of the operator, the material spilled, the amount spilled, if it's a green dot, the cause of the spill, the exact location of the spill, and whether or not that spill contaminated a waterway. Speaking of, this is a spill that happened between, kind of between Carlsbad and Carlsbad Caverns National Park due to a truck rollover. It was a spill of 2,730 gallons of produced water or toxic wastewater into the Black River, right outside of Black River Village. I just wanted to highlight this one. It happened in October of last year. I did look up on the state's records that it has been so-called remediated. There has been soil testing and water testing done, and that's actually where this photo came from, is from the remediation report. So spills happen all the time. They contaminate soil, they contaminate water, and as I mentioned, they're happening at a rate of 4 every single day. All right, the poll answer. If you chose B or C, you're kind of both right. Right now, the oil and gas industry produces around 4 barrels of toxic wastewater for 1 barrel of oil. And that amount is projected to increase to 10 barrels of wastewater for every single barrel of oil. And that's coming from the Department of Energy. Zooming out for a moment to climate, 2023 was the hottest year on record last year. It was also the hottest year for our oceans. 2024 is even hotter yet in our oceans. And just a couple years ago, 2022 was the highest profit year in the oil and gas industry. They made more money than they ever have before. So we've got a big problem. The New Mexico Permian is the epicenter right now of national fossil fuel expansion and harm at the worst possible time for planet Earth, while companies' profits are higher than ever. If there was ever a time to keep fossil fuels in the ground and shift to a just sane energy economy, now's the time. All right, so here's what we're doing. There's a lot of text on these slides, and I'm going to move pretty quickly because I know we're getting close on time, and Charlie has a lot of great things to share with y'all, so hopefully you can stay just a couple minutes after. But we're working to stop toxic oil and gas waste reuse schemes. There's a public comment hearing coming up May 13th through 17th. Please reach out to me to get involved and give public comment at that hearing. We have a petition to ban PFAS and trade secrets in the oil and gas industry. There should be a link in the chat soon about signing that petition. Please do. And also, there's a lot of other ways to get involved. I am going to share these things in the chat so that we can move on to Charlie. And I'll also share my email address so y'all can reach out to me too. And sorry for taking up so much time, but I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you for the time. Back to Kevin.
Thank you so much, Melissa. No need to apologize at all. That was really, really helpful. A lot of really great information. I appreciate that. I share the links to the frac tracker map about New Mexico spills, as well as the link to Wild Earth Guardian's petition in PFAS and chemical secrets in oil and gas. I encourage all of y'all to take a look at those. And thanks again from Melissa for sharing all that and for all your great work. I'll drop the link to Wild Earth Guardians again in the chat so you guys can connect with them, follow them, sign up for their email list, and see the great work that they're doing. Next up, for our final speaker, we have Charlie Barrett, who is the New Mexico field advocate and thermographer for Earthworks. Charlie spent 8 years working as an ecologist in the Texas Permian Basin for Texas A&M, as well as Texas Parks and Wildlife, before he joined Earthworks about 2 years ago. His work supports the strengthening of policies while helping to improve the enforcement of environmental rules and regulations in Mexico. And sort of to highlight the importance of Charlie's work, you heard that Melissa mentioned that there were 3 air monitors on the New Mexico side of the Permian and 0 on the Texas side. So without folks going out there with thermographers doing this thermal imaging to see the methane, well, the air monitors wouldn't pick up the methane anyways, but to see the kind of emissions and releases that are happening from these sites, we wouldn't really know what's going on. So I appreciate that. Charlie, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kevin, and welcome everyone. And I will try to, same thing that Melissa said, if you want to learn more about Earthworks, just go to the website for the sake of time. I'm going to skip through some of that. Just 1 second. Let me know if can you all see my presentation? We're good? Okay, great. So yes, I work for Earthworks. I'm going to talk about today what we see on the ground as thermographers and how we use the data to, for leverage for better environmental rules and regulations, and how we use that data to help protect communities. So what is optimal gas imaging and how does Earthworks use it? So our goal is to use data to expose the harm caused by operators and enforcement agencies to detect emissions, and we use it a little bit differently, though, than enforcement agencies in the oil and gas industry. Although we do use the same equipment, we use a GF320, which is an industry standard FLIR camera that uses infrared technology to detect methane, benzene, toluene, ethyl benzene, xylene, and a even larger portfolio of gases. So our goal is to use that data to expose the harms caused by operators and local communities. And we leverage that in a number of ways. We work with local, national, and internationally syndicated media. And 2, we use that data as leverage during the legislative session to advocate for stronger rules. And 3, by filing complaints with the two main enforcement agencies, which are the New Mexico Environment Department, the New Mexico Oil Conservation Division, and we just developed a relationship with the State Land Office. I'll talk about that a little bit later, in hopes that there will be some accountability and to deter the state from issuing permits to bad actors and repeat offenders. Just wanted to give a little bit of an overview on what we did in the past year. So we conducted over 250 surveys, and we tallied over 300 venting and flaring events, and we filed over 100 complaints. And as you can see, we've had 0 response from the New Mexico Environment Department. While NMED isn't responding directly to us, they are responding to operators and launching investigations and imposing some fines. And I will talk about that a little bit at the end. But they often will reject our complaints for trivial reasons. Sometimes it's due to language in our complaint process, but it's kind of silly considering we have the same technology that they use, and we also have the exact same certifications that state enforcement agencies have for their thermographers. And wanted to talk a little bit about venting and flaring because this is one of the primary concerns in New Mexico. It is one of the main sources of emissions. Routine venting and flaring events are increasing because production is increasing. As Melissa said recently, in the final quarter of 2023, the Permian Basin surpassed the Gower oil field, and Saudi Arabia is the largest oil producing field in the world at about 5.8 million barrels per day. And another thing that is important to mention is that oil and gas equipment is designed to fail. In fact, it has to fail because you have to release pressure, or otherwise you're going to have a much larger problem. So a lot of the different technologies that we've discussed about mitigating those emissions are really useless in some ways because the equipment has to release pressure. And one of the most common ways to do that is through venting. So the video that you're seeing here is a repeat offender. It's a small operator, and it's a stripper well. But this is a vent stack just releasing straight methane into the atmosphere. And oftentimes this happens. I'm going to show you another image or another video. This is a tap rock operating facility. This is a new facility. This is a frac site that has some of the newer technology to help where it's supposed to mitigate or reduce some of the emissions. But another issue is improperly lit or malfunctioning flares. And so you can see a small heat signature at the top of this flare, but you can also tell that it really isn't, combusting all that much. So, and this behavior, or these practices of emitting or venting and flaring have been prohibited since 2022, but the Oil Conservation Division in 2022 decided to implement an agreed compliance order. And what the agreed compliance order is that Oil Conservation Division assumes that the operator cannot comply with the law. So they have essentially created a mechanism for operators to circumvent the rules and regulations by simply reporting them. So the reason we continue to see lit flares and venting and emissions events like this is because there's really no reason for them to be accountable. They don't have to be. It's cheap to just continue to do the same thing, since the enforcement agencies don't have the capacity to regulate. They can essentially do whatever they want. So wanted to talk about enforcement just a little bit more. Again, NMED and OCD have mostly been unresponsive, and while they're not responding to us directly, they have launched investigations and imposed fines on different operators, and they are citing our complaints in that process. But since no mechanism exists to actually check the status of your own complaints, because NMED hasn't directly responded to us, we typically find out that actions have been taken by reporters that we have worked with, who are following up with us on like future stories. However, I know that sounds pretty grim, that NMED and OCD just simply don't have the capacity and created this mechanism to circumvent those rules. We have established a strong working relationship with the State Land Office. They have welcomed our complaints. We do meet regularly with Stephanie Richard Garcia, who is State Land Commissioner. And unlike NMED and the Oil Conservation Division, the State Land Office has a lot more power as far as oil and gas facilities on state land. They have the ability to reject permits and to seize operations of those facilities. One of the things that they can't do is they cannot penalize an oil and gas operator for venting and flaring, since the state, regardless if it's on BLM, private, or state land, NMED has regulatory authority over those types of emissions events. And then the other downside would be that the State Land Office does not have, well, they have a lot of facilities, but they're more difficult to access, and there are fewer of them. Sorry, we are going to run out of time here. I will try to get through this really quickly. I hope you all can stay, but if you can't, I totally understand. So a few takeaways here. So we have these great new rules and regulations, and New Mexico is kind of seen as a leader in passing and implementing environmental rules and regs, but why aren't things improving? And the reason for that is, as you increase production, you're going to increase pollution. The other thing is that the agreed compliance orders are probably our biggest obstacle to having meaningful enforcement in New Mexico, because they essentially render rules and regulation useless, or basically they're rules and regulations without any teeth. The other part is lack of capacity and funding with enforcement agencies is perpetuating this problem. 2 years ago, during the legislative session, there were many bills that were proposed and supported by our governor that unfortunately, fortunately, were killed in committee, and there was some funding for different enforcement agencies that was vetoed during that process. And so we are actually operating on less funding than we were 20 years ago, and we've almost doubled or more than doubled our production in that time. And so it's difficult to enforce rules and regulations when you have the ACOs in place, but you also don't have the appropriate amount of personnel or funding to run those organizations. And one other thing I wanted to talk about is, plugging orphaned wells has been a big topic over the last few years. We routinely film and document emissions at plugged facilities. The reason for that, well, the majority of the time, the existing infrastructure is left behind. So if you plug the well casing, that's great. But if you leave the tank batteries and separator tanks behind, and you don't vacuum the product out of those facilities, then they just continue to emit 24/7. And there's a lot of other issues with equipment failures, like open thief hatches and I guess the thing that I want people to take away from this more than anything is they're not leaks. These emissions of the events are intentional. They have to be to protect, people living in and around these facilities, but to also protect the oil and gas industry. If you don't release pressure, you're going to have a much larger problem like an explosion. And the last thing I wanted to go over real quick were just a few successes here. And I know we're running out of time, so I'll skip over much of this, but our surveys have led to some repairs in the field. I routinely revisit facilities we have filed complaints on to see like repairs to separator tanks, repairs to fractured tank batteries, and things like that. And I posted 2 pictures on here because there have been, while fines seem to be a slap on the wrist in New Mexico, somewhere between $50,000 to $250,000 for egregious violations. Our work was recently cited in a consent decree from the EPA when they fined Mewbourne operating, which is one of the larger oil and gas producers in New Mexico, over $10 million for repeat violations. And I took a picture of the facility and posted it here on the bottom slide. As you can see, there's just, product leaking all over the tanks, but there's also a vapor recovery unit installed at this facility, which has also been touted as a solution to this problem. But you can't recover any vapor if you're venting or your hatch is open or, you're releasing uncombusted emissions from a flare like that. It just renders that type of technology useless. And I happened to be on site the day that the fine came through from the EPA. And so I took a selfie of this because I was really proud that our work was cited in that decree. And also I just thought it was hilarious that I happened to be on site when it happened. So while all of this is pretty grim news and production is increasing, like there's been some really cool stuff that has happened in New Mexico due to the hard work of all of our coalition partners. And if we keep this up, like things like the fines that were issued to Mewbourne will hopefully influence operators to change their behavior. We have a long way to go, and I'm not suggesting by any means that we're close to that, but I just wanted to close out with something a little positive. Some good things can happen, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to give my entire presentation, but thank you so much for those of you that were able to stay late. And yeah, thanks again for coming today.
Thank you so much, Charlie. I appreciate that. And thanks to everyone for staying on for an extra couple of minutes. We'll take questions for a few minutes if you want to drop your question in the chat. And I'll start running through some of the great ones that are already in there. Thomas Singer had a question for Kaylee. Do folks in your region talk about when oil and gas is going to wind down or when production might start declining and what the economy will look like for their kids and grandkids?
I think some people amongst themselves might have some discussions, but in terms of leadership in the region, there's not much discussion of what moving forward might look like. As you all are aware, we all are getting information from different places nowadays, right? And you can be in your own little silo when it comes to media and what's going on in the world. And so what you run into a lot in this particular region, especially people that have been here for a long time and have seen the oil and gas boom, these boom and bust cycles, they think to themselves, well, it'll just bust and then it will come back again. And so sometimes there's just kind of this denial of reality. But I will say there are some pressing realities that have become hard to ignore, I think, even for people that, don't believe in climate change or are not thinking about these things. And that's the fact that we are running out of water, right? We're also seeing climate impacts every day. That becomes harder and harder to ignore, these wildfires, all these different things. And then also the Permian Basin is set to plateau here in a few years. And people that are really in the know about this, about oil and gas, they understand that. People that work in the industry know those things. And so I feel like that tide is slowly shifting to where hopefully leaders will be thinking about these problems more often, especially as we see the world transitioning to cleaner energy sources. People will be filling it in their pocketbooks. So oil and gas companies will be filling it in their pocketbooks eventually. And so Yeah, we're talking about it, but not as much as we should be because we definitely need resources to transition to a cleaner economy in the future, and our resources are being depleted currently.
We also have a question in the chat from Kel from Lingo. Colleague, her question is, or their question is, a colleague suggested that with meters and all valves and mass balances accounting, one could know exactly how much gas escapes. So the question is, who can require operators to implement such measures, state, federal entities, investors, lenders, customers? And I guess that's a technical question maybe for, well, anyone on the panel.
I say for Charlie, maybe. I don't know.
I was gonna say Charlie, but it would put on the spot. The tech guy.
Yeah, I honestly don't feel like I could answer that question right now.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty technical question, but a good one. We'll flag that for later. Any other questions in the chat before we hop off?
I did just want to announce for folks that Interfaith Power and Light and Citizens Caring for the Future are hosting one of the immersion retreats that I mentioned during my presentation, May 9th through 11th here in Southeast New Mexico. If you're interested, feel free to reach out to me or Sister Joan Brown. I dropped our emails in the chat.
Fantastic. There are a couple of great announcements from Kaylee and Melissa in the chat for how to follow them, as well as Melissa put their various events and some of their calls to action in the chat too. For the questions in the chat, we'll be recording, or this is being recorded, and I'll edit it and share it ASAP. So you can review it and encourage folks to share the recording with others. This is a really great and wonderful overview of everything, well, not everything, but close to everything that's happening in the New Mexico Permian Basin. Huge thanks to Kaylee for talking about the organization's work, Citizens Caring for the Future, as well as the political context, health and environmental issues they're dealing with. Thanks to Sarah for being willing to talk about what's happening in Jala, New Mexico, and the horrible situation there with oil and gas boom and the recent expansion. Thanks to Melissa for talking about Wild Earth Guardians, all your important work statewide, as well as some more context on the climate impact, as well as the spills. And I encourage y'all to check out that map from Frac Tracker. I'll repost that in the chat, and I'll share the chat with the recording. And again, thanks, Charlie, for giving us a good overview of the thermal imaging, kind of what you're finding out there in the regulation situation and how you guys are working to fight back. I appreciate you sharing some victories too. I think but the encouraging message I have from all these events, and this one in particular, is seeing folks like Kaylee, Sarah, Melissa out there pushing back hard, and over time we'll win these fights. It's hard in the moment, but it's really encouraging to see these, and I'm really thankful for all y'all coming on to share, talk about what you're doing, and I encourage y'all to follow all these organizations, to keep in touch with them. I'll share any calls to action with the recording, so you can take action on those things, and just keep up. Thanks all for the hard work, and thanks everyone for attending today.
Thanks, folks.